Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about recent lessons for corporate directors' use of emails. And joining me is someone who we've had on the show before, and we certainly welcome back. Please welcome Katherine Henderson, who's a partner with Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati. Welcome back, Katherine.
Thanks for having me again.
I'm sure that you've seen the recent court cases that sort of have cropped up where email discovery and attorney-client privilege ended up being important issues in the case. And I was hoping that you could sort of give a little summary on what directors should learn from those particular cases as far as emails go.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. We've had two recent cases in this area. In both cases, the plaintiffs tried to argue there was a waiver of the attorney-client privilege because a director used a third party's email account. And in one case, the court found a waiver, and in the second case, the court found no waiver. And these cases are very fact dependent. So I want to be careful, to say there's no bright line rules here. And there's a lot of different things that the courts look at. But essentially, they're saying, does a director have a reasonable expectation of privacy if they're choosing to use a third party company's email account to conduct board business? And the most important factor, the ones the court really focused on, was whether that third party had a privacy policy in place that addressed a use of email account for this type of purpose. And in the WeWork case, the court found there had been a waiver, and there were a lot of different factors, but the court did focus on the fact that the third party in that case had a pretty stringent privacy policy, which essentially said you can't use the email account for any kind of personal business. On the other hand, in the Dell case, the privacy policy in place did actually allow for personal use, limited personal use, but the court placed a lot of emphasis on that when they're looking at whether the director has an expectation of privacy in those communications. So while there's a lot of different factors that go on in whether the court's going to find a waiver, I think it's a good idea following these two cases for directors to look at the privacy policy that's in place if they're going to choose to use a third party's email account to conduct board business. It's certainly a factor that the courts have focused on. So I think it's a good idea to know what that policy is and think about whether any changes need to be made.
Yeah. So I can remember in my years on a public company board, it's sort of being drummed in my head to be careful on what I do that's corporate business and using my personal email account. And over the years, I've seen cases where not only has a director sort of been embarrassed, because their personal email has been hacked. And we've certainly seen that with government officials and others who have had that happen, but also there's a sort of a discoverability and a loss of maybe some rights in that. But what do you that's my experience, but what do you tell directors sort of in the personal email realm?
So I think it depends on the circumstances. I wouldn't say that you should never use a personal Gmail account. In fact, a lot of my clients do use a Gmail account because they're on multiple boards, and so they use the one email account for all of that. The courts have looked upon that favorably. It certainly eliminates the privacy confidentiality issues I was just talking about that were brought up in these other cases where they're using a third party's email account. As Gmail can have some security issues. You have to weigh the security versus the privacy versus practicality. And my take-home message for directors is it's most important that you're getting the information that you need and you're seeing it when you need to see it. So I think you need to balance all those factors and figure out what email account and what use of email account is going to make sure you're getting the information you need, but also balancing the security and the confidentiality concerns.
That makes perfect sense. So I do know that Diligent offers a messenger program, which is basically a secure interboard or intermanagement kind of vehicle that also can be monitored by a corporate secretary or a GC. And I think it was built just to deal with situations like this. But does something like that necessarily protect you from the attorney-client privilege?
Necessarily is always a tricky word, right? I think the board portal products are a great solution to this problem, right? Because they address the security. For the most part, they do address the confidentiality. If your everyday board business, the company's controlling it, board minutes, board presentations, I think it's a great way to manage those. But I think you have to also maintain flexibility. You need, I think a CEO needs to be able to update his board in real time if there's some sort of emergent issue. So does that kind of board portal system allow that? Is it a one size fits all? I think you need to be flexible on that. And it depends on the CEO, right? And the GC, and can you get those emails out quickly? If your director's on vacation, are they going to see that type of communication? So it's a great solution, I think, for probably 90% of board business. But I think each company needs to look at it and see, is this the perfect solution for everything? I think company emails are also a great solution. I have a bunch of clients who have email accounts given to each of their directors, and they ask their directors to have all board business be on the company emails. Again, a great solution for security and confidentiality for 90% of board business, where you're going to have some sort of control. It's also great for litigation, right? Both products are going to be really easy for me as a litigator to come in if, in the inevitable situation where you end up in litigation. Everything's in one place. So we can go to the company and collect those email accounts. We can collect from board portal. I think that works really well, and it kind of protects the director and your personal business. Whereas if you're using your Gmail account for your personal business plus 5 or 6 boards, and I have to collect that for a litigation, sometimes I have directors that are not really aware that that's the reality of the situation. So I think, again, you have to balance those considerations with practicality of, is the director going to be looking at that? There's a lot of convenience to having everything in one email, so you're seeing everything that comes in. So you balance those two things against the security and the confidentiality.
Again, this has been drummed in my head so much. I always had a worry if there were any type of discussions connected with like a merger or an acquisition or something, where if it leaked out, and you ended up being the source of the hack or something like that. But, again, I'm probably have been had the pendulum swing way to the other side from a secure perspective. But let me ask you a question. Is there other advice that, quote, counsel would give board members on use of emails?
For me, there's no one size fits all type of regime. I think you have to look at the company, the director himself or herself, how they conduct business. You need to make sure the director's seeing the emails. You need to make sure those emails can be kept confidential. You need to think about cybersecurity, right? I think we've done other of these talks where we've talked about the increasing prevalence of cybersecurity. I always tell my directors, don't write an email unless you want it on the cover of the New York Times, right? So, there's that consideration as well. But if you have something particularly sensitive, I always give the advice to set up a separate email account for that particular issue. So, for example, a special committee assignment, I think it makes a lot of sense in that kind of world where you're going to end up in litigation, then all the emails are in one place. You can collect them, they're being kept confidential, because sometimes you have confidentiality within the special committee that the company is not necessarily within that privilege, right? So you need to actually protect that privilege as well. So in those particularly sensitive areas, and you mentioned M&A can be another one, it may make sense to set up a separate email, and maybe you have it be a separate company-based email where the GC doesn't have access to it, unlike a normal email account. I just think it's important that you maintain flexibility and you pivot to the needs of a particular circumstance. 90% of board business, a board portal might be great, or a company email might be great, but it doesn't necessarily address each situation. So I think the important take-home message is just to be cognizant If you're going to use a third party's email, make sure you look at the policy just so you know what's there. If you're having to fight over this in litigation, at the end of the day, you may not want to have to be in that situation. You may not want to use a Gmail account that you use for personal business if that's going to open it up to litigation. So just being cognizant of all the different factors and then figuring out what works best for you and the company on whose board you sit.
Yeah. Well, listen, it's always a pleasure to have you take some time and come and sort of straighten us out on these issues. So, Katherine, I want to thank you again for this time.
Thanks for having me.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardroom. So we hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.